I'm Samara. I'm the programmer of Circuit Montreal. Welcome to this kind of unique, this is a unique moment in industry programming. I mean, my title is industry programmer. This is very much a glitch in the system that we're able to do this today. And we were just talking about this Japanese concept of a tree bath, where people go into the forest and just kind of recharge, and apparently your cognitive senses are amplified by this experience. So it's kind of a gift we're giving to you today. I know tomorrow is an especially big day for most of you. So in preparation for that, we're giving you this little inspirational interlude with these two remarkable human beings who are kind of, I don't know why I think of the word prism. It's kind of like things, it seems like both of you in your own way, like the reality, I guess, because we're a documentary film festival, the idea of reality, the way it passes through you, kind of it comes out the other side with kind of different kind of luminosity and color. And yeah, you've both been inspirations to many of us in this room, so I'm really glad you're both here. So thank you. Jonathan Harris, Melissa Auf der Maur, in conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be part of the anti-industry moment of the day.
I like the idea of a glitch in the matrix.
Yeah, and I don't even know what part of the glitch, but I better live in the glitch all the time. And part of that is I feel like coming from Montreal is an anomaly in North America, as we know. We were going to, well, we just met an hour and a half ago on the corner of Saint Laurent and Sherbrooke, and we already had our 1 hour conversation that we traveled many places to get a fast organic download of each other. And the simple structure is we're each going to do a little 10-minute introduction of ourselves. He came equipped with keynotes. I came equipped with a very messy laptop, and I dragged like 5 photos so I could just have a visual to balance some of my introduction of it's going to be hard to squeeze it into 5 photos and a 10-minute introduction. I am Melissa Auf der Maur. I'm born and raised in Montreal. I grew up 6 blocks away from here. I was lucky to go to Face and Mind, both incredible schools from this. Basically, since my mother sent me to Face in grade 1, I have seen I've been given the opportunity to use all media as expression of who I am and hope to be and dream to be, and I credit majority of what I've done and how I have been nurtured to Montreal and to the public art school that I went to. So Montreal has made me, and I've been in the United States for 20 years. And I live in duality and in pain every day, and this week might be the worst of it. This is the most difficult time I've ever come home to Montreal. So thank you for having me back. Well, how do I do it? There we go. So Montreal is the foundation. I went to Concordia, studied a major in photography. I started taking photographs at 13 at the cool alternative high school. I had a darkroom there. I was the only one that used it. And my life with the camera began very young age, and I was very shy, and I only played music because I played in the bands at school. But then I loved music more than anything, even more than photography, but photography was the alone time that I had in the place I could be most expressive. So I went to school in photography and was planning on being a photographer my whole life because it was alone time in the darkroom and with the protective lens between me and the world. And then music captured me quite literally. I was taken hostage by a band Hole, and I joined an American rock band and went traveling around the world. It was not my plan. It happened to me, and I accepted that I was invited to join a rock band. So this is an example of the majority of the 90s. I traveled stages and lived in airplanes and hotel rooms, and I felt so terrible about leaving my photography path behind that I photographed obsessively. At the peak, 1 roll per day. I photographed pretty much every stage I ever played, every audience I ever played to, and many, many, many hotel rooms. So this is sort of like the outside world of what I was doing. That's what it kind of looked like. It was very chaotic. It was an exciting moment in music, an exciting moment for women in music. But this is pretty much what was going on in the inside, is I would spend a lot of time alone with my alone craft of photography. And I also was raised in Montreal without TV. So then all of a sudden I like live with like a permanent TV and a tour bus, an airplane, a hotel. And what is this TV? And what is, and this, you know, you can see, obviously I traveled with not only like 5 cameras and a tripod, but in incredible amounts of like foot pedals, and like I photographed with all these like weird gadgets. And side note, my iPhone was invented however many years ago. I've never taken a picture since. And I am now currently working to digitize my 30,000 35 millimeter negatives to figure out what I'm going to do with this body of work, which I don't know why this one, because I ended up doing a photo show of just my relationship to the television in hotel rooms, and that one always really like, it's like my totem of my life in a rock band. So then that was like a decade of life, and then the 21st century arrived and lots of things changed, and I made a couple of solo records after I left Hole in the Smashing Pumpkins, and the last one I made in 2010 was a multimedia, and at the time, believe me, Capitol Records was like, multimedia concept album? It was like a fantasy film, a comic book. It's going to be at like museums and cinemas and on stage. Like, that's not music. Like now, like literally I was like arguing with people like, there's going to be more than just a record. Now people would like be, you know, they literally were intimidated by it, and I made this record called Out of Our Minds, and this is how I met why I'm here at Redem, is I produced a film called Peter and the Farm with my life partner and creative partner, Tony Stone, and I met him because I was looking for a filmmaker to make a fantasy film version of my album at the time, and luckily I got dropped from because I am the anti-industry part of the day, I got dropped from all the labels, and I was able to self-release. Actually, with the Phi Center here, they were the ones who ultimately released the project with me. It was a film, music, photo, comic book, like a weird, and I don't even use a computer, so it wasn't even a computer version of it. It was only like, it was only the real life version of a multimedia project. And then after that, my partner and I co-founded Basilica Hudson. So this building, and I think some of the conversation that will evolve with Jonathan is how physical place is transforming our project of life. And this building is an 1880s reclaimed industrial, all solar powered factory in the Hudson Valley. My partner's from New York City, I'm from Montreal, and we moved to the Hudson Valley for geographical reasons, which was it's in between Montreal and New York City. And we got a cool old house, and from our window we saw that building, and that building essentially shows us there was a guy who had cleaned it up from being an old glue factory and gave it to us quite literally. He holds a mortgage, and he had a vision for it to be a community cultural center, but he was sort of like a Burning Man guy before Burning Man, and like in his 60s, real visionary, incredible, and he just sort of chose us like, you guys, do this. And so we founded it in 2010, right as we got pregnant and finished that multimedia album. And this has been the biggest project of my life so far. And it's it's a multimedia community center, and it's focused on film and music, because Tony and I came with film and music, but then it has morphed into what the region is, which is an incredible region history of agriculture and culture, all wrapped into one beautiful and very, very forgotten and economically very depressed place in America, which luckily through my relationship to this place, I understand a little bit more about why shit just went wrong, is that real America is in real pain. And that has been, as a Montrealer, one of the biggest turning points of my life living in the United States, is understanding what arts and culture can or tries to do for those who are raised with no health care, no education, no access to arts and culture, and no supports to arts and culture. So this has been like a pretty large project that ended up morphing into why I am here is presenting this film, is that Tony and I, when we co-founded Basilica Hudson, he stopped making movies, I stopped making music, and we just went put it into building a space to show other people's films and music, and mainly to bring people together. And in that time, on weekends and evenings, we ended up spending a lot of time on his family land. His parents bought an off-the-grid chunk of land in Vermont in 1969, where Tony spent his summers as a kid. And the only relationship he really had there, other than with the land and the woods, was with this farmer, Peter, that they knew from the farmer's market. And this turned into a documentary. We've been working on it for the last 4 years, kind of in tandem of becoming parents, in tandem of creating this industrial, urban, rural place for arts and culture. We'd escape to Vermont and spend time with this man. And actually the next screening is right after this. That's at the Cinematheque. But this has been an interesting sidebar to, and actually quite central piece to the many projects that are morphing out of our lives, our questions about urban, our question about, do we live in the land, do we live in a small city, does that feel better than a big city, and the escape from the little city, escape from the small community, go further and further and further and further into the woods, and then go spend like 3 years in the mind of like a man who lives alone on a farm. And would that be better? Could that be how what the next chapter is? Not sure. So that's how Peter and the Farm came about. It's been a very interesting project, because it's nothing like a rock band, although actually it kind of is. And then, real side note, we got married in our piece of Viking art. So down here is the remnants of an old 1880s logger camp that we had made a fantasy film with my last record, Out of Our Minds, about a bleeding forest, also timeless female force that traveled through time, through car crashes, and got to the bleeding forest. And that Viking church was built as a totem in the last few years by Tony to embody for us to get married in. And so we celebrate our 10-year anniversary, and our daughter, who's standing there, is 5 years old, River, and our friend Josh Painter, who's a Taoist monk, married us in a off-the-grid pagan wedding about 2 weeks ago. And somehow I end on this personal note, even though it's about our creative journeys, because I have all essentially morphed into one place and one project called life. And I end on this because it might have been the greatest party. I have been to many parties, but we created an off-the-grid new wave dance party with communal teepees, illegal New Hampshire fireworks, off the grid, quite literally one of the happiest soirees of our little personal lives. We shared it with a group of people, and a lot of what we do at Basilica, what we do with films and music, is trying to bring people into a shared experience, or just like obsessively bringing people into a shared experience. I certainly love people, and I think the majority of everything I've done since my years in Montreal, growing up in such a culturally vibrant, connected, both my parents very devoted to the cultural community fabric of Montreal, is I just try to recreate that everywhere I am, whether I'm in a band or whether I'm in the woods or in a small forgotten town in upstate New York. It's an enveloped shared experience that should always have a little bit of new wave and teepees and ancient ritual mixed with primitive structures mixed with digital new wave synths. That's my introduction. I'm sure I forgot many things.
So I'm going to get up and do the same in a second, but I just want to preface it by saying, it's so wonderful that Samara decided to connect us, and I think as Melissa and I have gotten to know each other even over the last few weeks over email and the last hour in conversation, we've realized that there's a kind of astonishing number of parallels between our journeys and where we're at now, kind of psychologically and creatively. And it's just an interesting time we're living through right now with the American election, and just trying to think, like, where do we go from here? And there's a feeling that we're kind of off the script now, and people don't really know what's happening, what's going to happen next. And I choose to find a lot of hope in that, because I feel like when reality is most malleable and unfixed, that's the time when it can be shaped the most beautifully, even if there's a lot of kind of suffering in that process. So I find this to be a hopeful time, actually. So I'm just grateful for this connection, and I've been to Basilica a few times without knowing Melissa. We have some friends in common in that town, which is interesting. Anyway, I'll do my little ditty, and then we'll do our talk. I was born in Vermont, which is where Melissa's film is set and where she and Tony met and fell in love. And I was born right on Lake Champlain in Shelburne, Vermont, just about under 100 miles south of here. And I like her husband, Tony, I lived in New York City growing up, but spent summers going to Shelburne, where my mom's family's been for over 100 years. And in my 20s, I did a lot of these kind of data visualization, very high-tech, computer science-based projects that had me kind of traveling all over the world, giving a lot of talks. Gave a TED Talk. I had a project in MoMA, and I don't know, just a very kind of high-flying life for a while. Lots of airplanes and hotel rooms and speaking to big crowds. And through that process, started to feel increasingly like I'd kind of lost connection with a central core, like I was kind of head in the clouds all the time. And I'm not really going to go into that chapter except to say that it was about 15 years of my life kind of enmeshed in computer screens and the mindset of code. And I was very enamored with the idea that the human species was evolving into a kind of single organism in which each of us takes part, much like cells take part in a body. Living their individual lives, but also contributing to this larger collective. And I was interested in the way that the internet could be seen as a kind of nervous system for this new meta-organism, which was our species. And I was interested in making portraits of it in different ways and asking, how does it feel? What does it think? What does it believe? But I'm going to today just focus on the much more recent experience I've had over the last 6 months or so, which was that I moved back to Vermont on March 5th, after years of living away. And I moved back to our family land, to a 176-acre farm that has been in our family for about 100 years, called High Acres Farm. And that's the main house there. This is a photo taken in the 1950s. And there's some barns and stables and other buildings and lots of fields and forests and a private beach on Lake Champlain. It's an incredibly beautiful place. And it's a place where my grandparents lived. My mom grew up there. That's my mom in the middle on the horse when she was a little girl. And it's a place where her dad on the left, my grandfather, lived, and where my mom lived as an adult. And they both were very, as you can see, very kind of glamorous, beautiful, fashionable people. They were also people who had serious shadow sides. They were both alcoholics. They were both very depressed. My grandfather was a pilot in World War II, and he had pretty terrible PTSD from flying wounded soldiers back and hearing their screams in the back of the plane. My mom took care of him when he was in the last few years of his life, when he was very abusive to her, and that kind of really affected her way of seeing men and way of seeing herself. She kind of had this outward way of presenting herself to the world, which was very controlled and proper. She was on the board of the Met Opera in New York City. She always dressed impeccably and was very polite. She even had two handwritings. She had a formal public handwriting, and she had her private handwriting, which was kind of a wild, illegible scrawl. And she divorced my dad in the mid-90s, and she lived alone in the house up in Vermont for the last 20 years. And during that time, she increasingly isolated herself from the world and kind of disappearing into a world of cigarettes and alcohol and meat. She didn't eat vegetables. She only liked to eat meat. And this was one of the kitchen cupboards I noticed on one of my visits home, which those red marks are the traces of her fingernail polish from all of the meals reaching for a plate to eat alone. And she died the day that I moved home, March 5th, just about 7 months ago, after being ill, acutely ill for a few months. She was home on hospice care and actually died about 2 hours after I finished unloading the U-Haul truck. And when that happened, my sister Amanda and I were kind of thrust into this new landscape of not only grieving for her, but also dealing with all of the logistics of a death, the cremation, the memorial service, selling her apartment in New York City, weeding out the incredible amount of stuff she had hoarded in the house in Vermont, and as we turned to the future, starting to think about what to do with that land. And this is land that I've felt very drawn to my whole life. It's one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been on Earth. It's also land that has always haunted me a lot because of seeing how it affected my mom and her dad. And I felt like it's a place that has a lot of shadow to it. And I've been very hesitant to build my own life there for fear of repeating the historical patterns through another generation. So in my capacity as an artist, I was also starting to feel like I was hitting the wall with these digital projects, and that I was interested in changing my art practice and enlarging my understanding of what was being created. And at the same time, I was starting to grapple with this notion of family lineage and history and generations. And for me, this meditation started with these stones, which actually I just realized Tony's stone, that's interesting. But these stones that are all over the beaches that surround Lake Champlain. I've been growing up looking at these stones, collecting these stones. They're shale stones, and they have these white lines of calcium carbonate running through them. And actually what those white lines are is the old shells of crustaceans that once lived at the bottom of the oceans that used to be all around where we stand now. And those shells would dissolve into the water and get carried into cracks in the shale, the clay at the bottom of the ocean. And then when the oceans evaporated millions of years later, these white trails were left behind. And then when all of that broke up, you see these stones that are now in all of these fragments. And thinking about these stones, I was really interested in this idea that they can line up and connect, and that these things that are now separate used to be whole. And what would it be like to make them whole again? What would it be like to take these fragments and bring them back together again? And through this process, I ended up meeting a glassblower. This is an installation by this glassblower named Ethan Bond Watts that was installed in the hospital just down the hallway from where my mother was in the intensive care unit. And he started a glass apprenticeship when he was 12, and he's in his early 30s now. And I asked him if he would teach me how to make glass, and if we could make glass together. And I was interested in engaging in this kind of alchemy process to take all of these different ingredients that had family significance, like crushed up stones from our beach, my mom's ashes, and other family relics, and if we could somehow gather the other needed ingredients to make glass, and if we could transform all of those things into this single, clear, homogeneous solid. And so we started working in March. And we've been working for the last 7 months on this kind of insanely complicated, quixotic glass-making process. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through that quickly. We started by gathering quartzite, Cheshire quartzite, from the mountains of central Vermont. Cheshire quartzite is largely silica, which is the main ingredient in glass, and we collected about 6 boulders of it, the size of large watermelons, brought them back in backpacks, and started the process of crushing them up using sledgehammers and a steel rod until we got them down to a talcum powder granularity, like a Johnson's baby powder. We had a big bonfire with a bunch of my mom's things, a lot of her paperwork and old journals and things like that. And from the ashes of that fire, we dissolved those ashes in water and boiled away the water. And then the salt crystals that remain on the pan at the end of that process are called potash, sodium hydroxide, a very alkali powder, which helps in the glass-making process, which you can see there. We took a bunch of these stones from our beach and crushed those up into a powder also by hand. This is me and Ethan here at the Shelburne limestone quarry, where we got limestone powder, which helps stabilize the glass mixture. And then this is a vase that Ethan made that holds my mom's ashes, and some of those went in also. And so we made this mixture of all those ingredients And then we started some experiments with this mixture to see if we could turn it into glass, starting with a blowtorch initially. And after a lot of trial and error, we were able to get these little, we call them the snotty raisins. They were the first nuggets of glass we were able to make using our ingredients. And then we wanted to do this at scale, so we set about building an oven. We started by making some clay pots, some crucibles, some bowls that would hold the ingredients in the oven. And then we picked a site in the hills around our farm, and we dug a long trench about 18 feet long in the hill, and we dug a lot of clay out of the ground, and we mixed it with gravel and straw to make a cob mixture. And then we started the process of building an arched furnace about 18 feet long on the hillside. And gradually the furnace took shape. It has 3 chambers. The bottom chamber is where the wood goes. The next chamber is where the glass ingredients go, and the third chamber is where the glass objects slowly cool once they're made. We started firing it and doing some early experiments. We experimented by putting a door on the front. Then we added a chimney. We weren't getting temperatures even nearly hot enough, so we kept having to change our design to try to get something that would work. Then we started adding a door to the front, using some steel from a local barn that had burned down this summer. And finally, the thing that really made a difference was adding a leaf blower to it. So we had an iron pipe going into the fire chamber, and we put a leaf blower going into the iron pipe, and that was blowing 150-mile-an-hour wind into the fire chamber, and that's really what made the whole thing work. And then we had this tremendous wood pile that we got from a local lumber collection that was in that barn that had burned. And after many tests, we finally fired this up about a week and a half ago. I think it was almost the same day that you did your ceremony, maybe a week after. And we started an all-night vigil. We lit the fire at 6:30 in the morning, and it went for 30 hours. The glass chamber with the crucible slowly getting hotter. And then we slept out on the hillside that night, just sleeping in 90-minute shifts as we waited for the temperature to get up hot enough. This is the glass chamber door here, which is kind of this strange cyclops. The hole is so that you take a steel rod and stick it in there so you can move the door to the side without burning yourself. And as the temperature got more and more extreme, the fire became more and more thirsty for oxygen. So the flame started licking around the door of the glass chamber. And eventually they started also coming out of the hole in the front. And we noticed that it was forming the shape of a phoenix coming out of the chamber where the ingredients were being transformed. And I'll show you a video to give you a feeling of how intense this was. Could we do the sound? Okay. Sat watching this for about 5 or 6 hours that night in this increasingly surreal evening that we had. We had a couple really strange things happen. Basically, as the night bore on, our furnace started collapsing in different ways. First of all, the glass chamber door that you see there fell and shattered into pieces at about midnight. The choke on our leaf blower broke off, so we couldn't use that anymore. The steel door on the front of the oven started to disintegrate because the heat was so intense, and the hardy board, which is the insulating material in between the 2 layers of steel, also disintegrated. So there was 1 layer of steel left that was glowing yellow, waiting to also disintegrate. Then around 4 in the morning, our crucible that was holding the molten glass cracked, and the molten glass started dripping away into the oven out of reach. And so our plan, which had been to wait until sunrise and try to blow some objects in the daylight, quickly had to be scrapped, and we had to try to make these objects in the dead of night at about 4:15 in the morning before all the molten glass dripped away. And on no sleep and very cold up on the hillside, Ethan was able to make 3 glass objects using our transformed ingredients. And once he finished the 3rd object, he tried to get a gather of glass. There was hardly any left in the crucible. If the crack hadn't happened, we probably would have made 40 objects, but because it cracked, we could only make 3. And as he tried to gather that last time, the leaf blower stalled, and he went to restart it, and the cord broke off. The whole thing to us had the feeling that the oven had its own kind of sentience, almost like it was a being that was aware of what we were trying to do. It seemed to us a little bit like a horse who would faithfully carry its owner to the edge of an oasis in the desert and then collapse of exhaustion and die. It kind of took us just to where we needed to go. So anyway, we were able to make these glass vessels. And for me, this glass-making process has been part of a larger series of what I call rituals that I've been working on to try to cleanse the psychic history of that place and of my mom's family. And so these vessels will get used in a future ritual that I won't talk about today, but I'm still kind of actively engaged in this process. And in the meantime, we're turning our attention to the future and looking at what to do with this land. And my sister and I both feel that it's too extravagant of a place for either of us to live in as a private home, as my mom did. So we'd like to turn it into a kind of cultural center, retreat center environment. Not so different from Basilica Hudson. And so the end of this summer, we held a gathering of kind of friends and mentors to come and help us imagine different possible futures for the land. And I just want to briefly tell you about that. It was the first kind of event we've done on the land in its new form, and it was centered around meals. And we had this incredible table that came from a 200-year-old maple tree that was cut down on the farm. And the table consisted of these 4 planks, each of which were 20 feet long, and we had them on sawhorses and on tree stumps, and so we could move them to different locations and have meals at different places on the land. So the first dinner we actually had in the water of the lake, so the water was up to people's legs, and eating on stone plates with our fingers, eating fish that were caught in the lake, and then the weekend kind of progressed from there. And it was just felt so wonderful to have new life in the land and looking to the future. And all that I want to say about this weekend in terms of what came out of it was that my intention going into it was to come away with a kind of clear sense of what we were going to do, maybe a mission statement or a structure or a name of some kind. And what came through in the experience from everyone was not to do that, but to just try little small things and trust that over time, over the next few years, a structure and a path will emerge organically from that process of experimentation. And so not to have a plan, not to know what the future looks like, but to trust the process as it unfolds, to make a move that feels clear, and then to wait until the next thing feels clear, and then do that, and let the path go from there. And I think as we bringing it back to the larger world situation right now, I think as we confront this uncertain future with the Trump presidency and the rise of kind of extremist politics all around the world, I think there is this sense that we don't know what the picture of the future is that we want to create. There's a sense that things are changing, but people don't know into what. And the reason that I find this to be a hopeful time is that I think if there's anything the 20th century showed us, it's that ideologies don't really work, no matter what ideology that might be. Communism, socialism, capitalism, whatever, all of these isms end up failing. And maybe there's a radically different way of relating to reality that's being called for now, which has less to do with having a vision and implementing the vision, and has more to do with a humble process of listening and surrendering and allowing life to happen through you, and to allow the path to emerge organically from that process of listening. And I think in our own ways, Melissa and I are both trying to engage in that way of living now, and thinking about art not as something that exists within a frame necessarily, whether that frame is a rock and roll album or a website or a photograph, but actually enlarging that frame to include all of life. And actually what we're trying to create is a world that we want to live in, and that we want to invite other people to live in too with us. And I think as artists, this is such a inspiring time to think of our work as frameless, as actually being just life. So maybe I'll stop there and we can chat. Cool.
Yeah, the bridge of what you're saying, the experimental path. There's the basilica as this saved and not destroyed, that moment, the Industrial Revolution. Part of what inspired Tony and I to take on that project was just the fact that it survived, and really good engineering and builders made that building, and there was a moment of industrial hope in America and all around the world during the Industrial Revolution. But what you just said about the experimental path, and then also well, two things I want to bridge from that is we built the Basilica, which right now in our 6th year, we only just attained our 501c3 status, and it wasn't because, it was because we didn't have a plan. So we were not a nonprofit, we were not a for-profit, we were just exactly what you're about to embark on with that. And now that we are organizing our experiment and working with people from the nonprofit world and people from the for-profit world and people who have run museums or people who have run cinemas or people who have run festivals, because neither of us came from any kind of organized industry. We just sort of made music or made records, which required a bit of production, but it wasn't an industry. We were living outside of, and I have to say that is it's a good way to go, because what I'm seeing now in like the beginnings of grant processes, and in fact Canada, in all of the incredible government support there's one thing, America has the opposite of that. There is no support other than individual philanthropists essentially, and a little bits of federal and state, but that stuff is this small, and you have to work 2 years and write things this big, and it like stacks of paper. It really is individual supported in the U.S. And the more I learn about the institutions, like great nonprofit art institutions in the U.S., the more grateful I am that we suffered through this experimental. We had no funds. We just sort of like used our credit cards and our friends and our love and our ideas, and through that we shaped a mission that I didn't do it justice when I presented the Reclaimed 1880. I just showed a photo because I was trying to show a kind of fast totems of what my life has manifested in physical, but the experimental path of that is what needs to be preserved, because in the frame of a mission statement or a funded concept that I could go to 5 millionaires and say, I would like to create, thank God we didn't start that way, because it has morphed and it's going to continue to morph. And some people who work in institutions like that have said to me when I've been like picking people's brains of how do I sustain this dream, this experiment in this beautiful, that it has a relevance, it's an economic stimulus in a very poor area, and it's got a legitimate, it affects people in a good way, but they said, beware of institutional like uptightness that would stop us from being able to be spontaneous like that, and that's helping me further expand the mission, which is protecting the spontaneity and the morphing and the changing. And it might just become a beacon of green energy for 10 years if we have to be. We might just become a resource to help people get off of fossil fuels if we have to be, or we might become a bomb shelter, which we won't have to be. But who knows, like, thank God we didn't start with a mission statement, and that in some ways, I think, like you said so well, of our lives, it's no longer like, out there, I'm going to make an art project that will say something. It's actually like right here, right now, all the time, I have to be genuinely trying to make, set an example of like a genuine exploration, a genuine, because there is no plug, no box to jump into to fix these unfixable problems.
Yeah. One of the ideas that came through that gathering that we held was actually an idea from architecture, which is called gradual stiffening, which is an approach to house building, which might be that, well, you find some land and you make a fire to cook your food over, and then eventually you say, well, we're kind of cooking our food here, so maybe we'll make a place to hold the pots, and then you have your kitchen, and gradually you have this increasingly stiff structure which has arisen organically from the needs. Have you found that a stiffening has been occurring for you, and how do you stay spontaneous while also inviting structure?
Well, luckily, in like just the sort of multidisciplinary part of the mission statement that naturally formed is that we work with farmers as well as working with visual artists, contemporary dancers, filmmakers, musicians. So it's stiffening in that we're becoming more and more flexible to house anything. So in some ways, and that's actually a testament back to architecture, this building is so beautiful. It's an open 17,000 square feet of many different spaces, but the main hall is 6,000 square feet of just, you can do anything in this space, and it is a testament to architecture that is sort of sets this like dramatic stage for anything. It can be one person with like a video installation or 2,000 people watching a rock show, but I think that what's stiffening is the constant open-ended possibilities. But it's actually all boxed into one actual beautiful space that is some sort of totem to man's ability to make these strong, long-lasting, powerful buildings. But it's you know, in the poeticness of reclaiming that building that was built to literally melt steel. It was a forge and foundry for steel railway wheels, and the poetry of the repurposing and the reusing of what was once a great American dream and clearly has broken and failed. And how are we, as these totally different types of workers, honoring that kind of work ethic that might help this country find that country and all countries, but how will the creative industries and the creative economy help build a stable future? But I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
So you and your husband both started as artists, basically, and now I understand you're working with farmers and other people in the Hudson area. How have you found your work has been received by the types of folks who maybe weren't part of your past?
Yeah, we have been very fortunate to not, I mean, for example, I would say the duality, you know, Tony is more of the building is a beast, and Tony liked being able to build a big Viking church in Vermont or connect solar power to a little shack in Vermont. He has tackled the building, and so through that he has created an incredible relationship with like the Department of Public Works, through the electrician, the locksmith. So Tony has built this incredible relationship with the working people who make the cities tick, you know, and so that has been really rewarding for him, who grew up in New York City with old school New York, Tribeca, Soho artists that all were maybe plumbers and carpenters too on the side, but they never were like plugged into the Department of Public Works. So there's been an amazing, I think for Tony, a real sense of connecting with the structure that makes urban or, you know, a shared society work, and they have loved us. They are so excited. Like some of their grandmothers worked at that glue factory, that they are so excited that we like took this building that they just saw sit there empty for 50 years. So we've had a beautiful bridging with them, and then I'm more, say, the social the communicator that brings the events in and brings the audience and the content in, and you know, we have an equal amount of relationship with the young farmers who, the Hudson Valley is rich in agricultural, just like Quebec is, of course, but the young farmer movement is the more active one, so we have a great privilege to be friends and work and eat the food of these incredible young, hardworking farmers, majority of which are women. So most of the farmers I organize with and work with are women in their 20s who are waking up at 5 a.m. and milking their cows and growing our incredible turnips. And everybody, probably because we are genuinely listening. We're trying to figure out how to work with everyone without coming in with an active like social cause. We're going to work with farmers and artists. It naturally occurred. We weren't.
Yeah, I remember so one of the friends we have in common is a woman named Kaya who runs one of the projects in Basilica called Kite's Nest, which is kind of a education program for local kids. And I remember meeting with Kaya when she was starting that, and I was so inspired by the approach she took, which was to devote an entire year to just listening. Yeah. The first year of their organization, they spent all their funding for the year, their whole budget was not producing anything, it was just listening to the community. And I thought that, like, to devote such patience in the world today is so rare. And now, I think 4 years later, it's totally thriving, as I understand. And I think it's so much to do with having the humility not to think that you know what's needed, but to actually listen and find what's needed. I think I don't know if you've thought of this before, but it's really poetic to me that your building was once a glue factory, and now you're kind of sticking people together.
And that I'm a bass player. That is, I don't know how many of you know about the role of the bass player, and I accidentally made a career in music. As I mentioned, like photography, observing was more where I was aiming towards, and my accidental love of music. The role of the bass player, and I won many bass awards, and I'd have to like talk as the bass player. And not a lot of people notice the bass player, but everybody feels, and it's the glue that connects these, like the lead guitar, and I had actually not thought about even the bass and glue connection, but yes. Yes.
I think another really rich topic that would be interesting to talk about is ritual.
Yeah.
And I know so you were married 10 years ago, but you reestablished
We actually never got married. We got married for our 10-year anniversary in order to make room because we have devoted the last 6 years in creating public events, which are ritual, especially in the music. So, like, no offense to film, but music is, like, we all know, a different experience. There is a beautiful ritual to sitting into a quiet movie theater and watching, and I am concerned about that dying and going away, although I was happy to see that people were going to the movies for this festival. But it's a very scary loss of ritual, just the movies alone, but the power of music and that shared experience. And I'd say the height of Basilica is our music events, and one of them in particular is a 24-hour drone music event where it's a 24-hour event, and you come, or we ask you to come, or you can come in and out, but for 24 hours. And it was the first vision I had for the building, which is how do you bring the ultimate immersive sound experience that's not about one band, 6 bands. It is just a continuous sound. There's over 100 musicians that participate, and hundreds and hundreds. And we started it like experiment. Like we didn't have a grant for it. I just stated we are going to have a 24-hour music event. And when at 3 o'clock on the dot, when like people from Philadelphia showed up with backpacks and yoga mats, they're like, we're here for the 24 hours. I'm like, they came and they listened, and that is one of the most powerful moments of public ritual that we do. And of course, having played music since I was this big here in Montreal, the ritual of shared music experience to me is the ultimate. And I didn't go to church as a child. I played music, and I've always used the parallel that it's obviously the same powerful spiritual exchange, and I understand how music is such a big part of the use of certain religions, and sound, and is used in incredible rituals in religion. So I come from a ritualistic practice of playing music, so that we definitely bring a lot of that into it. But then just down to like the name of our space, Basilica Hudson. It was named by an architect who went in after the original guy cleaned it out, and the original basilicas in those factories that we showed a picture of, they're inspired by that original architecture with that turret system in the old Byzantine basilicas. But those were, you think of them as churches in Italy, but they actually originally, when you look at it, is just the gathering spot. So the ritual of the human, so the farmer's market definitely feels as ritualistic because it's just this human communing. But I think like the wedding ritual, had I not just devoted myself to making these public rituals for people that I wasn't even playing, like I had spent my lifetime playing music, and then I removed myself, created a stage for public sharing of ritual, and like the proudest moments I've had is creating that space for people to experience that. And when I'm removed from it, and I'm actually part of it, I feel like, that's essentially why we got married, is I never thought about weddings until I became a real organizer of ritual for shared, and I realized like, I'd like to carve a little moment out for my tiny, tiny little family in this huge, big world of potential rituals, of just honoring the intimate ritual, which I had not actually ever romanticized or cared about. And I want to know, in this cleansing, this amazing project of your mother into glass, which is just incredibly so beautiful, but what was your relationship to ritual and religion as a child? Like, how did you inject? Because like your computer data work is like the anti-ritual to the anti-industry. That is the least, like the most terrifying digital to me is the end of ritual. Like, I'm terrified of it. But how did you find it?
Well, it's interesting. So my childhood didn't contain much technology. We lived in New York during the school year, but I was a very introverted, shy child, and I also had a lot of health problems as a really little boy. I had near-miss SIDS, so I stopped breathing in my crib a few times and had to be resuscitated, and I would have seizures where I would just kind of stare blankly into space for like a minute at a time, and my parents would shake me and I'd be totally unresponsive, and then I'd like come back to consciousness. And I passed out about over 20 times before I was 20 years old in different contexts. And so I feel like I've always had a strange relationship that I still don't understand with reality and leaving reality, and coming back to reality and leaving reality. And and I think as I've moved through life, in some way my grasp on reality has become more slippery, and I often feel like I'm partly here and partly not here. And I think for me, ritual has been a recent addition to my life. I didn't really grow up with religion, except
Did you
for
grow up
nature.
with music?
I didn't even really grow up with music. I think nature and solitude and art making were things that I sought refuge in. But I think for me, ritual has been a way of, it's kind of like, I think of it as prayer. It's a kind of way of renegotiating one's relationship with reality, and maybe even transforming how reality unfolds from that point forward, and into the past, because it sometimes there's the feeling that time is also something that's very malleable. And so when I'm doing these rituals that have to do with my family, there's a feeling that I'm also doing them for my grandfather, wherever he is, and for my mom, wherever she is, and that somehow by freeing them from their psychic burdens, it frees us from ours in some way. And so for me, I think of ritual as an act performed in the physical world with a certain intention that has a transforming potential with what you could call the spiritual world, and so it's a kind of way of negotiating those two realities. As for data and technology, I think I actually, for years, I was seeking a kind of transcendence through data. I was really enamored with this idea that there's a kind of omniscience in the network, that there's a kind of emergent intelligence happening through the network. Now I'm not really so sure what I think about that. Even as that idea has become more and more mainstream and more fashionable. Like there's a famous line in a movie about Ray Kurzweil, who some of you guys know. He's the singularity guy, really the kind of in-house philosopher for the post-human movement. This idea that humans will be merging with machines soon, and that in some way we already are because of pacemakers and things like that, but that eventually we'll have the ability to search the internet directly through thought, and communicate with each other directly through thought. I watched this movie about him, and the final scene is the camera zooming out of Earth into the cosmos, and Ray Kurzweil's unmistakable voice comes on, and he says, people are always saying, does God exist? And well, I say, not yet. And that's exactly the kind of like arrogant thinking that Silicon Valley computer scientists like to engage in, that they're kind of creating deities out of data. I don't know, I think it's stranger than that.
Yeah, and I think, you just went into the scary digital anti-nature world, but like a few steps back, and then also in your presentation about what your potential project is, there is let's be sure, no matter how much longer we have here, is the man, woman, in nature, and what you spoke about that being a solace to you as a child. My relationship to Vermont currently, but also to my life partner, who is an urban person who had that sacred ritual with nature. And when I met him and started our relationship in that off-the-grid Vermont land, that his family was lucky to just, his young father bought land in the 60s because the apocalypse was coming at that point, and he just wanted to know that he could go hide somewhere. And we're very fortunate to have this truly unplugged parcel. And when I arrived there that day 10 years ago, it was the gateway for me of everything I had been missing. Growing up in amazing Montreal, where you have like incredible, you know, an enriched life, but what I knew intellectually, but I was like in rock bands, and I was missing the nature component, and using my life as like a symbol of the return to nature, and as this digital, horrendous digital forest of hell has grown around us and through our fingertips, disgusting. It truly, there's not one sacred part about it to me. I think it's bad, is that this return to the land, which you know, we're in, what's great in the Hudson Valley and definitely in Vermont, because it never left, is like man and land, the back to the landers. You know, Vermont was a big, but most of Vermont had not left the land. That was, they'd changed their farming ways, and industrial farming is a problem and was a problem, and it isn't sustainable. But like this whole relationship to, you know, prior to, what is it, just a few hundred years? Like whatever the original relationship we have to this planet that we have completely disconnected from, I think is the definite answer that Mother Nature is the God that does exist, that we have abused, and climate change is without a doubt our biggest problem. David Suzuki, who I've had the pleasure to call as a friend and do have intimate, you know, drives in a car with, and asking him, it's like there is now, you know, the clock has been ticking for a long time, and the turning point has passed, you know, as far as rewinding. So at the very least, we owe nature the relationship and the respect that it deserves. Obviously, we should all try to get off of fossil fuels. We should all, but just as a human respect to being products of this planet, is we need to commune with nature, or we are seriously missing out. And we children should be in nature, and children should not be on the internet.
Yeah, and to that point, this is a point I'd like to make, because I feel like it's important now. I mentioned it last night in a presentation I gave, but I just want to say it again, which is shortly after my mom died, like minutes after my mom died, my sister and I were with her in her bed when she died, and my sister left the room to go find her husband, and so I was alone with my mom. I had never been with a dead body before, and I had this strange compulsion that I wanted to open her eye and look in her eye. And so I walked around to the other side of her, and I crouched down next to the bed, and I first looked at her teeth. I kind of moved her mouth back and just looked at it, and it felt really strange to touch a face and feel the flesh with no response from the body. And then I opened the eye, and I looked in her eye, and it was an amazing human eye. All of the complexity and the color, and it reflected back my image. Just this incredible thing, and totally empty of life. Whatever was in it that had animated it and brought it to life wasn't there anymore. And in that moment, I just had the strongest sense that that her body was, that all of our bodies are spacesuits that allow us to stay here and experience this amazing reality. And they allow us to eat food and breathe and have emotions and make choices and believe in time and all of this stuff, and hear music and do everything. And that when she died, that it was like a discarded spacesuit, a piece of clothing that had been discarded, left on the bed. And so everything that happened with her body, cremation, etc., didn't feel like it was her. It felt like it was a symbol for her, but it didn't actually feel like it was her. It was so clear that that was a spacesuit. And a couple weeks after she died, I had to go to Toronto to speak at a kind of a virtual reality conference. And it just struck me that these bodies that we have are the ultimate virtual reality machines, and we already have them. and how lucky we are to have them.
Nature is IMAX.
Yeah,
it's really cool. You should go out there.
It's just amazing. So, I guess my hope for technology is that it ultimately leads us back to a deeper appreciation for the amazing world that this strange, mysterious enigma of a riddle that we find ourselves in, and that we can relate to that in more beautiful ways. I also see there was just the 15-minute sign, so maybe if we want to have some questions for a few minutes, we could do that.
It's up to you guys.
Or we could just
if there
keep
are
riffing.
questions.
Yep.
A fellow Montrealer, Marie St. Pierre, who's an artist and designer. It's now doing the festival circuit. In the film, she talks about artists being problem solvers. They can find new ways to find solutions that other people can't. And she was a problem child because she was an artist and wasn't allowed to recognize it. But fortunately, she had the influence of a great artist, Jean-Paul Riopel, who changed her life. And Melissa, in your case, you touched upon the fact that you went to art school. And I've talked to you before, years ago, and you talked about how that changed your life. And I was wondering if you could talk about art in the early, as a child, and how it made a difference.
I mean, what's interesting is growing up in the city, I think that art school was the only option, but now raising a daughter in a small town, and she goes to a nature school, essentially based, it's a Waldorf school, but it's in the woods, and the whole, for as long as she's in nature, looking at leaves fall and talking about like the difference between the two oak leaves, I feel like that's good enough. But as far as, I do think it's actually different whether you're living in the city or living in the country. But I think, I'm sure all of you who are from Montreal know about FACE, which is just like every place should have a school like that, which is essentially founded by a bunch of arty parents in the 70s who decided that the trick, other than I love school. I've been dreaming of going back to school. I can't stop these. I just want to go back to school. Art made me love school. My art school made me love school. Whether that's I'm glad I didn't become a career academic, honestly, because I do think that can get to be pretty horrendous as far as just too much thinking, too much boxing, too much boxables, whatever it is. I think, though, that the structure of education, if you can trick a child into liking that, have lots of art classes, have lots of music, visual components that are not these academic. I was terrible in English, terrible in history, terrible, like cheating on all of my papers, and the teachers knew it. I was really good at photography and visual art and choir and music, and luckily, I imagine if I had gone to some crazy academic school, I'd be a total failure at everything I do. So I just know that certain people, and me being one of them, I would not have been nurtured in the way that I needed to be. And if I had grown up in like the fit, let alone another era where I'd expect to be a wife, like just like a house person or something, I'd probably commit suicide. Like that would have been really bad too. So I guess, art and music is the way from what that I see, and nature being the other version depending on where, but children have to be around those two things. To breed a happy person from my experience as a little and now as a mother.
Yeah, and what I, just very briefly, what I love about art as a discipline is the way that it can include every other discipline.
Yeah.
It feels like anything is fair game.
Yeah, history, science, you can go anywhere. Like, recently in making these film projects, I do, obviously, like music is my first, but the way that any topic, like it could be global warming or any single thing can be boxed into, I guess what you're saying, which is like problem solving of like, let's figure out a really, personal or experimental way to look at that topic, and express it in ways that someone else can think of it in a different way and not just like reading it in a newspaper or,
You're right now making a connection with all the artists that will lights in the United States in most uncommon place we would expect them to be.
You mean right now in the...
Well, they are already there,
Yeah.
but the connection, you know, your work you've been doing before, now the fact that you're connecting now,
Yeah.
and maybe there's some artists everywhere, but in the nature
Yeah.
that can make a difference. There's a lot of nature, and I don't know how you can try to make a connection as much festival as you can do, so you can enlighten, your country.
Now more than ever needed. Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, I don't know how you have felt about this, Jonathan, but I mean, I grew up a politician's daughter, but I went to art school, and there's like, you know, any person, especially lucky people, the 1% who have made a living being an artist or being a musician or being a filmmaker, there is an incredibly gross sense, and I talk about it often with my my friends, you know, the guilt of I'm just making art, and that guilt certainly fueled a bit of the making of Basilica, of I must also be creating a platform for other people to express themselves, because there's this weird, and it's not a healthy guilt, in fact all guilt is pretty, and I'm pretty free of regret and guilt, but I having been so fortunate, I've been able to make my living with artistic practice, there is a strange feeling of guilt, and in the past 5 days, speaking to artist friends and thinking about what Basilica Hudson can be in the U.S. as a beacon of freedom of expression and escape, you know, both escape from cities, but escape from this dreadful news source, and I think that there's an element that artists are healthy but do feel guilty about enjoying their life and enjoying their time and what they do.
I think that's education is the key.
Right.
As you said, I made a film about, I produced a series about all the school in Quebec as a province with Claire Lamarche, and we've done the film about your school face.
Oh, I want to see it.
And I'm getting my girl out of school because it's insane. I'm in Quebec City and I'm very near the nature. Yeah. But I think that, through education, that things can change. Because I think the potential of having more artists, it's just that because there's many artists that have not become artists because they did not have the chance to encounter a way of living, or a connection of having the solitude, the time to create. So you're a very inspiring person, and I wish you a lot of love and hearts.
I mean, I also think to what you were saying, Jonathan, about just like your life being, I think the education element is that you must love what you do. And that's why not everyone would have like thrived at FACE. Some of my FACE friends are stockbrokers, oddly enough. But most of them are artists. But the idea that you raise someone to love what they do versus, and that's what my family did so well, is they were both independent freelancers. One chose politics, the other one, they're both literary. And my mother actually used to work in this building as a Sierra Day. She's a dramaturg in the theater world in Quebec, and they love what they do. And I was raised to find what I love, and that's usually the key to success is love what you do. And if that could be an education principle, that'd be great. And back to why children should be in either nature or surrounded by music and beautiful things, is that will make them love working, and that's the key somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think this idea that we have to be suffering in order to be doing good work is just, that's got to go, you know.
Totally.
Also,
especially now.
And related to that is the...
Because we're suffering by being alive in North America, in the world.
But like, I think related to that is the cult of busyness. That's also another plague in our modern world. You know, people in the U.S. often say like, "How you doing?" Good, good, busy, busy, good, busy, busy, good. It's like they're synonyms, and that's always struck me as so strange. I mean, it's fine to be busy, but like, don't assume that that's like a synonym for good. And yeah, I mean, like it's kind of like, you know, what are we doing here? I mean, if we're fighting for some cause that's bigger than ourselves, that's great. But if we're doing that and we're miserable in the way, then what kind of example are we setting? You're basically saying, like, you know, if you also fight for the cause that I'm fighting for, you can be miserable too. I mean, that's a terrible sales pitch. Like, I mean, I love the Dalai Lama said something like, you know, I like religions that have joy. I want to see and say, I want more of that. Right. You know, like our lives are ultimately our teachings and our examples. And, you know. Yeah.
And farmers, because in the next hour I'm going to be showing the film that we made, Peter and the Farm. He is a tortured individual, but the guy loves to work the land, and that's the one thing that stayed, is he worked the land. He lost his wives, his children, everyone left him, but the land didn't, and he is an incredible worker and doesn't ever complain about the work. Complains about everything else, but he loves to work the land, and I guess that's back to finding what you love, but also work hard. Like, he complained about art being torture, and but never about the actual manual labor of the land. Like, that's so you know, you can be very busy without like complaining or even noticing it. Like, I'm never going to stop working. I just constantly am working, but I notice it when it's something that is like unaligned with making me. If it makes you stressed and mad, try to balance your life. But at the same time, you are obligated to work hard. I will not let people be lazy, or I guess just not my friends. I have no problem being direct about that. Is that what is the time and what is the question?
It's actually a small comment, but looking at your presentation and listening to what you were saying about education, one of the things that I find is most important is that kids not be told what's impossible.
Oh, cool. What to do or what's impossible.
Yeah.
Right.
And because I think in practicing art when you're a young child, you're in the realm of exploring. And you're not being told what's impossible, and you're not being told what are the limits of discovery.
True.
You know, and for some people, I think the digital world has had that appeal because it had this idea of endless possibilities, and you know, there's a threshold that was passed a couple of weeks ago when two AI machine invented a code that didn't exist in their initial programming because they were trying to evade the watchful eye of a third AI. So, you know, that's interesting. But coming back to the education, I think that's one of the things that art can do is show us that some things are possible instead of just being, oh, that's impossible, oh, that can't be done. You know, had somebody said, oh, you are going to create this and this and this and that and this and that.
Well, that's also that problem of achievement and what is success versus, you know, I mean, at least even in my life as music, I never thought success would be a Grammy. I'm like, success would be making a really cool sound with someone I really like. This problem of success and achievement and material disgustingness, which we are very fortunate to be sharing. You know, we saw the world lose a poet and celebrate greed in 48 hours, and that is the two sides. Do you want to live a poetic, graceful life, or do you want to be a greedy, hateful person? I mean, I feel like we're very lucky to have seen that so starkly and horrendously.
Can we do both?
Yeah. One can be an alternate reality in some sort of weird video game, and the other one should be the real one, but yeah. Greed or poetry? Which one?
Poetry for 200, Alex?
Yeah, it's obviously what's great is it's an endless conversation because may we all walk into the endless future and work really hard. And thank you to a great festival for making a new friend to each other. And I really can't wait to go to Vermont and share in the exploration and in the trying to bring people out of the grid to find themselves through nature and through discovery. And if you ever come to Hudson, New York, come to a big old factory. We usually have something nice going on, and there's some flyers over there. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks for your attention, and this was a pleasure getting to know you, and I hope it's the start of a friendship and a conversation that continues.